All right, in the RTS21 Architectural Digest, we come across field classes. Now, field classes is a custom item that I've generated specifically for Unity. It helps deal with the organization of data on the UI, but it also helps with the organization of data in the fields, or inside of the code. So let's take a look at this. So the challenge is that sometimes we have components with a long list of fields that goes on, and you have to scroll through them sometimes, and it can be a pain. So you want to section that off. Now, you could write your own custom inspector code that ends up doing a lot of it for you, or that does a lot of it, but that takes a while. It takes a while to write good custom inspector code. And it takes extra editor classes that need to be tied into it as well. And of course, there's also other tools that we can pull in that can help us out with this. But there's a much easier solution kind of built into Unity already. So what I want to call out is that our solution is basically to make child groupings of properties, both as an easy child code reference and in the inspector. So, for instance, if we want to call it in code, we might be calling this.ui.password or this.events.onHide. And in this project, the specific ways you'll see it is that inside of a component, a mono behavior, we will create a public serializable class, or maybe better to say a serializable public class, and we'll call it, whatever the purpose is, fields. Purpose might be UI, so UI fields, for instance. And we'll add the appropriate fields to it, text box, label, form, whatever we might have. And then we will create a reference to that in the same class, in the same component. Public UI fields UI. So that's where we get our this.ui.password, for instance. So let's take a look at it in the code. In the code, we have this one thing here called unit color. There are other items that are taking advantage of this, but you can see we're inside of a class. It's a mono behavior. And underneath that, immediately what I find are two serializable classes, one called renderer mods fields and one called texture change fields. So these are all the fields that relate to our renderer modifications. And these are all the fields that relate to our texture change. Okay, so when we're inside, or after we get done with those fields, which since they're serializable, Unity can read them and understand them in the inspector. But we can say public renderer mods fields, renderer mods. And then the other thing, texture change. Let's take a look at what that looks like in Unity. So in Unity, let me do a search for unit color. And then I'll click on factory. Let's go view it. So here's our factory. And inside it, you can see that we have an item here called unit color. In fact, I'm just going to minimize the rest of this stuff for right now. Unit color. There, that's pretty good. Okay, so this is our only one that's visible at the moment. And you can see underneath it, it has two other child elements, renderer mods and texture change. Those were our field names. For the classes. And then, of course, all the fields are exposed through this as well. Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward and clean example of how it gets sorted. Now, this doesn't have that many fields, but the fact that I was able to call out that these are for texture change, sometimes that reduces the amount of variables or the amount of text I have to put in to explain what a variable is about, because it's already got a parent item. Okay, so let's take a look at the actual script now. When I'm using this, you can see that inside of my code, I'm saying this.textureChange, .use texture change. So are we even using the texture change? If we are, great. Then we're going to change the texture to this particular texture that we've got. Additionally, we have colorize, so we're finding out should we be changing the renderer? This.rendererMods.use renderer mods. It could also be just .use. I don't need to call out renderer mods again here. So that might be a change I put in later, but it's not a big deal. And then if it is, then great. We will colorize the renderer mods. Otherwise, if we're using a texture change, we'll call the retexture instead. Okay, so that's how we use it. And you can see that this adds a set of organization. So when we're calling on data, we have less fields. because if they were all inside of the root game object, I could say this dot, and then look how many things there are to select from. Especially if it's a couple weeks later after I've done this, or it's someone else coming into the code, having to cycle through all of these to kind of figure out what you need can be a little tough. So it's much easier if you have a couple items in there, because when you're looking at Unity, you usually look for things matching these field names, which is another reason I don't tend to like the custom inspector option, because it's too easy to write things that don't match, and then it becomes harder to find. So in this case, it would be this.rendererMods dot, and then in here, there's only a couple examples. The basic object stuff of equals, get hashcode, get type into string, but then our stuff of field name, identifier renderers, and use renderer mods. All right, so that makes a pretty straightforward way to organize our fields. I recommend you keep it so that when you're going through, unless you only have a couple fields in your class and it's really quite small, then go ahead and put this stuff in there to help sort it out as soon as you have more than one category of fields. That's probably a good break point right there. As soon as you have more than one category of fields. And if you've got more than 5 fields, you probably have more than one category. All right.